Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
In this week's episode, we're going to be looking at the current rental market, supply, demand, high rents, and the impact on landlords in North London. Okay, so Romesh, the rental property market in 2023. How would you describe it now?
Good question, Rachel. How would I describe it? Well, right now, I would say it is just a crazy, chaotic market. We've got a situation where there is a real shortage of properties available to let out there on rental portals. And you've got so many tenants that are chasing properties. So it's just an imbalance, basically, I would say. What about yourself?
I
what
would
do you
agree.
think?
I agree with you completely. I think there's a massive imbalance of supply and demand. And I think probably one of the more concerning outcomes of that is the very high rents at the moment. I know there's lots of other issues leading to high rents, but yeah, the market is supporting that at the moment. And yeah, we've been talking this morning about the supply, the demand, and how that's manifesting itself. And from an agent's perspective, I would say it does feel slightly chaotic. It feels like if you have a decent property at a decent price, you're inundated the moment that property goes live. And quite often, you don't actually put the property live because you know of so many people who would be interested in that property anyway. People who you already know, you've already vetted,
Sure.
etc. So which just adds to the feeling that there's no supply. It's all doom and gloom, Romesh, all doom and gloom.
Now it is, but you just said something interesting there, made me think of a news report I heard in the last couple of weeks, and that was about the case of a property in Chadwell Heath. An agent had advertised and had 162 viewings, 52 offers for a two-bedroom house in Chadwell Heath. People coming from Harrow across to East London to have a look. I don't know if you heard about that.
I only heard about it from you, I have to say. Although I did hear about much the same sort of thing happening in Ireland. I think there was a case of that as well, of 100 people all sort of traipsing around the block. And the first thing, maybe I've been an agent for too long, but the first thing that occurs to me is like, why? Why would you have 162 different viewings on a property in one go? Just what kind of nonsense is that? I don't get that at all. I don't get it. I mean, we put a property live and we take it off within 24 hours. It's down because, you've got so many people who've applied. You should be able to find somebody from that, from the people who've applied who would be a good tenant at that particular property. The idea of meeting with 162 people and doing any kind of quality vetting is just like, nah, it's not. No.
I agree. I mean, it does sound like they've just created a lot of work for themselves and a lot of headache. But yeah, let's move on from that. I was going to say, I mean, if rents are rising and going up at such a rate, surely this is, from a landlord's perspective, a North London landlord, this is a positive thing, something good for them at the moment. Would you not say?
Yes. I mean, I'd say at the moment, I would say it's looking like the rents are sort of stabilising a bit. Yes, because it's all becoming a little bit unaffordable. From a landlord's perspective, yes. I mean, a lot of landlords, if you've got a mortgage on your property, then you've got increased mortgage rates and that sort of thing. People came off fixed terms and suddenly, boom, hit by massive increases in their mortgage payments, service charges, all that sort of thing have increased at the same time. So yeah, from that perspective, yes, but the risks that go ahead or that go along with increased rents and lack of demand and people being, people sometimes really needing to get a property, it's kind of those risks have increased as well. The costs have increased as well as risk.
I was going to say, obviously, the tenants and landlords, everyone's cost of living has increased dramatically with gas and electric prices going up. And yes, you're right. The costs from a landlord's perspective, on one hand, rent's gone up, but their mortgages, their service charge, their ground rent, repairs, maintenance, all of these things have risen over time because, to employ people to carry out repairs and maintenance, now that's gone up because people are having to pay higher rents to cost the whole cost of living. It's the whole cycle, really. So, but yeah, key question, can people pay it? And, what you don't want is have a tenant who is struggling and not able to pay the rent. So it's one thing setting a rent and then them not actually being able to, fulfill and meet that agreement.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. There's two different, let's say in this respect, there's two different types of tenants. So you've got the tenant that's already in your property and there's tenant that's applying for a property. You'll see most of the big rent increases tend to occur when people are looking for a new tenant. So your property becomes vacant. Okay, what's the current market rate? It is this amount, which again, coming back to your story about £1,200 and that property, it's just like £1,200 for a 2-bedroom property in London nowadays. You're going to be inundated. You're going to be. But yeah, generally, if you look at the rents that current tenants or existing tenants are paying, they are below the level that you would be achieving if you put a property out onto the open market now. So when you're applying, when you're putting a new property out, because you've got such high demand, then you'll find that there are people out there who can afford to pay that. And unfortunately, that means that people who can't are quite, sure we'll come on to this later on, but, if you can't afford one of these more expensive places now, what happens to you? So that's an issue. But yes, if you're advertising a property from scratch, there will, because of the current demand, be people who can pay it. But if you're looking at tenants already in a property, then yes, it makes no sense to put rent at a level that they can't afford unless you're prepared for them to fall into arrears, or you're actually happy for them to leave and find somewhere cheaper if they can.
So, I mean, so there should be some kind of middle ground, it sounds like. What would you advocate that a landlord should do where you've got an existing tenant, say, pre-COVID, sort of 2020, and they're on a lower rent than what's out there in the market today? What would you advocate in terms of raising rent?
That for me has probably been the biggest issue, is that, a lot of landlords don't just routinely put their rent up every year. So we have a clause in our contract that says that your rent will go up by X amount every year. But we always say to people, expect it to go up, but it really means may rather than will. It's very dependent on the landlord. And a lot of landlords appreciate that if you've got a good tenant who's looking after your property, paying the rent on time, et cetera, then they don't put the rent up every year because a good tenant is worth their weight in gold. So when we hit COVID, you find people who hadn't put their rent up in 2019, hadn't put their rent up in 2020, didn't put it up in 2021, wanted to give their tenants some space in 2022, but then boom, the interest rates went up and all of a sudden they've got what was already a low rent in 2019, 2020, and it's then a ridiculously low rent. To get it up to market level just isn't happening because it becomes completely unreasonable to increase rent by that amount of money. But still putting it up to anything that is perhaps going to be accepted by your mortgage company, that becomes a bit of a hike. So, yeah, I think one of the learnings that everyone's taking from this is the need to increase rent a little bit every year. So go by that clause, increase your rent by, 2, 3, 4, 5% every year so that you don't then need to have a bigger jump than necessary at the end if there is an increase in general rates.
Absolutely. I think sometimes people also, on the other side of the equation, they sort of forget that that their landlord may have been very fair and very reasonable with them, and they overlook that, and it's just a sense of outrage when they are asked to increase the rent. So I think you're right. Going at small amounts slowly on a regular basis keeps you in touch, not necessarily at the market level, but keeps you in touch with it, so the gap isn't so dramatic and so big.
Yeah, because anyone who comes along and, anyone who's living in a property and then they're suddenly told your costs are going to go up by £200, £300, £400 a month, that's a chunk when you're already dealing with, increased energy prices and all the rest of it. And also from a landlord perspective, not only are you looking at people possibly going into arrears or having to move, which brings its own costs with it as well. But one of the big things that we've talked about recently is damp. And if people don't have money available because for their energy, because they're having to pay it in additional rent, then that actually damages your property as well.
Absolutely. I mean, well, if they're struggling to afford their utilities, then that's going to contribute and make things worse in terms of the damp situation. If the properties, they're not able to heat it. But going back to the sort of the whole rent issue, I was going to say, in terms of landlords, I mean, are you coming across landlords who are basically wanting to evict tenants who won't accept a sort of a really dramatic increase? Have you experienced or heard that in the market?
I mean, you hear about it, but more from the people who want to portray landlords in a bad light, I would say. Although that said, I have suspicions about a couple of people that I've heard about who have, excuse me, who have removed their tenants and done some work, etc., etc. But in general, with our landlords, there's been negotiation, and there's the value of a good tenant and that negotiation to come to an increase that is fair. But a lot of people, if we say to them, your rent is going up by X amount, but you haven't had an increase in 3 years, they kind of begrudgingly accept it, because it only you just go onto any one of the portals and you can see what the equivalent property in your street or your area is going for at the moment. And I think a lot of people kind of recognize that. And on a couple of occasions where we have had an issue, as well as where we've sold a couple of properties and the tenants have actually had to move out of London over the other side of the M25 to be able to find something that is comparable and at the same sort of price.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's interesting that people are sort of being forced out further afield to basically achieve the same sort of type of property, really. But raises also another issue I was going to sort of mention, and that is if you increase rents on a property sort of to market levels, you also run the risk of sometimes people struggling to pay, which we mentioned earlier, and then maybe getting other people to move in with them. Sort of unauthorized occupiers is one word I could use, or overcrowding, or illegal subletting. It potentially opens up all of those sort of cans of worms, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I think I was talking to the people that do our referencing, and they were saying that the number of fraudulent cases or fraudulent applications is spiraling. Sorry, I should have the figures with me, but I don't. But yeah, they said it's considerably up on what it has been, which is slightly different to the subletting, but it's all part of the same risk of being careful who is in your property, because people are having to make themselves look much better to be able to get properties. And then when they get into that property, then they need to be able to actually afford to be there. And that's when people start saying, okay, well, there's an additional room. I've got a friend who needs somewhere to stay, or worst case, I'm going to Airbnb a spare room in the property. And then from a landlord perspective, who's in your property? What's the wear and tear on your property going to be like? Or in the areas that we deal in North London, sort of, I'm thinking Enfield, Haringey and Barnet, if you have, if you get into the realms of possibly needing an additional license for sharers, if you have somebody that invites a friend to come and stay with them and pay rent. And that's a whole nother kettle of fish.
Absolutely. And that's something that the landlord would not have wanted to sort of create and start, I would have thought.
Well, that's the thing, because if you look at, I know Barnet hasn't brought in their selective licensing yet. I think that's next year. But if you look at Enfield and Haringey, they both have some form of selective licensing for single families or single people, excuse me, or one or two sharers. Says that's selective licensing. If they pay a fee for that, and their property is assessed and deemed to be suitable for renting, based on the single family or that level of people. If you start adding in extra people, that's a different license. That's a different set of requirements, and then potentially, a neighbour reports the property to the council. They come along, find there are 4 or 5 people living in this property, and the landlord's in a little bit of hot water.
Yeah, absolutely. I often hear stories about. We talked about sort of scammers and this kind of stuff. I often hear stories from sometimes from landlords and other agents that portals like Gumtree, OpenRent are sort of the kind of places where a lot of sometimes tenants, fraudulent tenants, or people who are purporting to take a property and try and sublet it and make some money or cover their costs. That's where they tend to operate. I don't know. Have you heard the same?
I've never. It's difficult because I don't want to say bad things about any one particular portal, but for me, I think there's a combination of landlords who advertise on Gumtree and also tenants who apply through Gumtree. Although sometimes people apply through Gumtree because you just know that properties are available there, but it's not somewhere I would be going for, either to look for somewhere to live or to rent a property out personally. But I think there's a whole different realm of fraudulent. So there are the people who are bad and who want to do bad things with your property, and then there are the people who just can't afford otherwise. So like you're saying about overcrowding, we get a lot of people who will phone up for a 1-bedroom flat, and you've got you've got 2 adults and a child, or 2 adults, a child and another child on the way, and it's like, but this is a 1-bedroom flat. It's too small for you. And they're not deliberately wanting to overcrowd the property, but because rents are so high, that is all they can afford. Which isn't really surprising. In Enfield, you're looking at a studio flat and you're looking at £1,000. At least you're looking at £1,000, and that's a lot of money. And so you can completely understand people thinking, well, I don't want to pay for a 2 or 3 bedroom property, or I can't afford a 2 or 3 bedroom property. We're happy that we can live on top of each other in a 1-bedroom flat. We're good people, but from a landlord or agent perspective, that's not the ideal. So you have a combination of people who are just doing it because financially that's all they can do. And then you have people who just professionally want to sublet your property and make money. And they're very different people.
Yes, no, I agree. That's an interesting point you make. So if I had a property and I had my tenants vacate and move on, what should I do in terms of trying to get new tenants? Which route do you take in terms of how you look at trying to let that new property? If you set your rent too low, then you run the risk of having millions of people, but I suppose the pick of the bunch. But if your rent's too high, you have that situation you just mentioned there where people are trying to overcrowd a property just because they simply can't afford it, I guess. What's the solution? What's the way forward?
Yeah, generally we say to people, go market rent and a little bit lower, because then you get a pick of people, if you like. It is difficult. I would say the few things I would say is you absolutely have to reference, because of all the fraudulent things. But then I would say you go through much the same sort of steps as you would do normally. You just do it more carefully. But you need to stay at the market level or there or thereabouts. You do find, if you have an existing tenant and you want to keep the rent low because they've been there for a long time, you value them, you know that they are going to struggle if you increase the rent, then that is one thing. But if you advertise at a rent that is way below current market, then you get the situation where just about everybody will turn up, and it's difficult to wade through them. And I think a lot of people also look at it and say, that can't be right. What's the catch?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I get approached sometimes by landlords who want to let properties to the council, and their property's been let for a number of years, and they approach us, and I get the feeling that they feel like that, well, if we're letting it to the council, we don't really need to do a lot, and we can give it in any old state, any old condition. Which I often have to put them straight and say, no, that's not the case. You know, if you're letting to a private tenant or to a council or local authority tenant, you still need to have the property up to a decent standard in terms of repair, decoration, and, you know, the finish of it, basically, you know, to try and attract the best tenant and make sure they look after those tenants. Are you finding landlords that are trying to sort of relet properties in a sort of cutting corners?
Yeah. I'd say there's a lot of that at the moment. I'd say from landlords and agents at the same time. If you look at even like the quality of pictures that you see on the portals nowadays, they've dropped a bit. Descriptions not as good. I think some of that is a little bit laziness, and some of that is, you know, if you put it on, it's going to be applied for. But I think for me, if you're a landlord and you have a property, and your property looks like you love and care for your property, then you'll find a tenant who wants to do the same. If you have a property that looks horrible and like you don't care at all, then, you know, why is your tenant going to care? But you do find a lot of that, a lot more. I know someone who has just moved into a rental property, which for me, and it's in one of the 3 boroughs, and they're paying £2,500 a month. And for me, the finish of this property is not what I would expect at all. And I think that was a sign, very much a sign of where things are at the moment, that people are thinking, I'm just going to let it anyway. I don't need to make it all shiny and fresh and lovely. And I think that's very disappointing. But it's interesting because
it is.
From the point of view of your landlords, so I know that you have to have different rules in terms of fire safety and all of that kind of thing. So they've got to put that work in and that expense before they let it through you anyway. But also in terms of rents, I mean, how does it work from your point of view? Everyone says that the LHA rate hasn't gone up for people looking privately, which is an issue in itself. But how are landlords paying? Oh, sorry, how are the council paying landlords if they go through a company like yourself? How are their rents competing or comparing to the market?
Well, in reality, in truth, they're not competing. They've never wanted to try and compete because the type of scheme is different, and so offers different sort of benefits in terms of the rent being guaranteed, so the risks not being the same. But they're really struggling to compete these days, or to be even competitive, so to speak. So we are finding that we're struggling to attract new landlords, and we are losing some landlords who are wanting to go to the private market because the council's budgets are so restricted and they're struggling, really. So it's not a good situation. So as a direct consequence, you've got more people who are needing assistance from the local authority because the councils don't have enough stock themselves anyway, which they were previously using, because that's been reduced. In addition, you've got more people who are having to move and vacate properties due to landlords wanting more rent or wanting to sell and exit the market, etc. So it's a very tough situation for the councils and for agents like us at the moment, to be honest.
So are you finding, did you say that you're finding your landlords are wanting to move back into the private sector for rent? And so how is your eviction process working at the moment then? Because I know sometimes it can be very difficult to get properties back from councils. How are you finding that if a landlord wants to get his property back and put it on the private market?
it's a very big problem, to be honest, Rachel. We have in our contracts with the local authorities that they would return the property. So if they're not able to find alternative move-on accommodation, so they'd always try and offer them something else, or ask us to offer that family another property. But if there isn't supply of property, then their only sort of course of action is to actually serve notice and apply to court and evict the tenant. But the councils are being very slow, and in some cases reluctant to try and do that because of there's time, there's cost, there's expense and work involved in that. So they're trying to sort of ideally move them on. But it's a big problem. We're having large delays where tenants are stuck in properties which landlords want back. Similar to how if you have a private landlord and they want their property back, and the tenant says, "I've got nowhere to go, I can't afford it," you're then forced to serve notice and then apply to court and get an eviction order. So it's a problem.
Yeah, I know from the private area, it's taking, say, 7 to 10 months, depending on which borough you're in, to go through the no fault process through to bailiff, which is obviously a long time. How does that compare on your side? So if somebody is saying, "Do you know what, Romesh, I'd like my property back because I think I can get £300 or £400 a month more than private rental," how long would they be waiting before they can actually realise that?
Oh, it's such a hard question to answer, Rachel. I mean, we work with a few different councils, and it does vary. Some councils, I'm not going to name them, but some are particularly bad and particularly slow and not taking sort of a proactive approach to it, and almost burying their head in the sand, it feels like, while others are actually trying and will try to work with you. But sometimes it can be 3 months later than when they should, and up to sort of a year, 18 months in some situations. So it is a very, very awkward situation for us, the landlord, the council, the tenant. So yeah, it's not good.
Yeah.
Not a good
so
problem.
The ideal very much is certainly from our point of view, is very much keep the tenant in place and negotiate over rent rather than just evicting and trying to find more rent, which just, I mean, karma-wise, that just doesn't sit well anyway. But I guess it's slightly more difficult from your point of view because you can't go to the council and say, "Well, actually, I'd like another £200 a month rent, please. Let's negotiate." I guess there's less negotiation.
It's not as easy. You're right. Some councils have started to sort of try and look at negotiating and offering a little bit more rent or incentives because they realise the market conditions are so bad and so against them that they're having to react. The problem with local authorities is they react generally in a sort of slow way, and so the market will have moved one way and they will be moving towards that, but then the market moves again or whatever, so that it's always quite slow to react, which is one of the downsides. But some of the local authorities are realising and thinking, we have to react here, we have to do something, otherwise we're going to be using local hotels, and some of them are using like the travel lodges and the travel inns to house families in because things are so bad in terms of the crisis.
So from a landlord perspective, then I was just going back to your original question there about, is it great for landlords? So I'm just thinking from a landlord perspective, yes, it is good that there is that demand, and yes, the rents are quite high. Do you see the rents dropping again at any point? Do you think we'll see a drop in rents?
In the immediate short term, I can't see it, but I think over time they will drop. Once sort of demand drops off. I also think there's a number of properties out there on the market for sale. I read a stat that Zoopla saying that 11% of properties that are on the market for sale at the moment were ex-rentals. And I think what will happen is a number of those won't be sold rather, because of people struggling to get mortgages or people not wanting those properties and the market just being quiet in terms of sales. And they will probably return to the rental market at some point, which will improve supply a little bit. But at the moment, you've got any property can achieve any kind of rent, regardless of condition and standard. And over time, those better properties will be able to maintain those rents, and the ones that are a bit shabbier and not well maintained or looked after, the rents on those will drop because the market will eventually be able to talk if there's a bit more supply. So yeah.
So hopefully things will level out at some point.
But
yeah.
Hopefully, yes. Who knows when? But yeah, I think there will be, but we might be looking at 6 months, a year, 18 months. We don't know. What about yourself? What do you think?
Yeah, I'd say broadly, I'd say there's a few things that are coming up in the near future that may well have an impact on the volume of supply again. So until they happen, I'm not 100% sure. So I'm thinking things like the renters reform and the energy performance improvements that are coming in. So that's all stuff that's happening in the next 2 to 3 years potentially, and I think they could have a big impact on supply, and perhaps in different areas to where we are now. So we'll have to watch this space, I think. But I think it's quite clear that the current situation can't be allowed to carry on for too much longer, and it does need some intervention. But
yes.
Assuming you're a landlord and you have a property, let's say you've got a property in lovely leafy Winchell Hill, and you put your family into this property, what would you recommend for a landlord? How does that landlord then keep an eye on their investment and make sure that bad things don't happen to it?
Well, if you're a self-managing landlord, I think you really do need to be hands-on and regularly inspecting, visiting, keeping in touch, keeping in contact. I mean, because if you don't do those types of things, you will find that sometimes tenants won't report things or feel in fear of reporting things because they're worried their rent's going to go up the next year or whatever. So I think communication is key. Ideally, to visit and inspect on a regular basis, whether it's doing it yourself as a landlord or using an agent and ensuring that they're doing that. I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Just you made me think that something that's come up a couple of times recently is back in the old days. I remember going to a presentation by an insurance company, and they were very specific that they did not insure landlords who had people receiving benefits in their properties, because their view was that people who are receiving benefits are less likely to raise concerns about general maintenance issues, and they would wait until something becomes a big problem before reporting it. And so an insurance claim has to be met rather than reporting it early. So like a dripping tap, leaving that as it is, and then not mentioning it until there is actually a flood, because they didn't want to be causing too many concerns for the landlord. Just keeping head down, keeping quiet. Yeah. And that sort of thing. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm just saying that was their view at the time. I have found recently that a lot of people, when it comes to mentioning a rent increase to them, they will mention maintenance issues that we're not aware of. Or we'll go around and do inspections and we'll find maintenance issues that would ordinarily have been reported, but people aren't reporting them. And I think that is an element of people keeping their heads down, not wanting to raise things that might cause a landlord to have to spend money because they don't want the rent to be increased. Yeah. So I'd say that inspections are essential now, really essential now, both in terms of who's living in my property, but also what condition is my property in. And that brings us on to damp, which I know we will cover again at some other point. But with all the increases in prices that people have had recently and all the slightly contradictory advice that people have had about, turning heating off in unused rooms and all that sort of stuff, turning everything down, we've certainly seen an escalation in the amount of damp and mold that there is in properties where people are trying to cut costs. Have you noticed the same?
Very much so. I think the cost of living crisis has had a big impact, especially on tenants that we have, where they're not always heating properties and they're struggling to heat properties. So we've seen a higher incidence of condensation related dampness, but we're also seeing there's sort of so much more spotlight on this, especially with local authorities, which is right in many ways. They're wanting to encourage people to sort of come forward and to report when they have issues of damp and condensation, which is good because it allows you to try and tackle the situation and the problem early, as opposed to sort of having this dramatic, terrible looking flat, which, has been just neglected and left and nothing done about it.
Mm. We could talk about damp, I know, for a very long time. So we will come back to that on another day, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I guess our general message, if I was to say my general message for landlords, it would be yes, it's great that for you that rents have risen, I would say, but be mindful about who can afford what, and the fact that you need to look at your property and check in on your tenant, check in on your property, and value the existing tenant, I think.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're finding that a number of our landlords they like the service that we provide, and they are trying to negotiate and keep our tenant and us involved, as opposed to just looking to sort of go to the open market and achieve the highest rent always. So I think sometimes there can be the idea that the grass is greener somewhere else, but it isn't always really. Sort of, I couldn't agree more. Value the situation you've got and try to just improve it and work with it, because if it ain't broke, why fix it? Is a famous old saying.
Absolutely. So my last question to you was going to be, would you, if your property was empty now, would you look to sell it or would you look to let it again?
What, to me personally, or just generally?
To a landlord, what would you advise?
I think that question is one of those $1 million questions. It really depends on the personal plans of that landlord and where they are in their sort of landlord journey, so to speak. Because if they're sort of at the retirement age and wanting to cash out and sort of have an easier life, and they've got other investments in place, then yes, you'd probably want to sell. But if you're sort of a younger landlord and you're not at that point in your lettings journey, then I would say, don't get put off by the raft of legislation and changes that are coming. These are all things that are bumps in the road that we all face and we have to accept. And I think as a landlord, you can overcome these. They're not as daunting and as bad as people think. Obviously, when you first hear that story that EPCs, you're going to have to do a minimum grade or whatever, there's that sort of immediate sort of, one wants to just throw their arms up in the air and go, oh God, what another thing. But when you sort of sit down and break it down, sometimes they aren't as bad as we always think they are, but it kind of feels like that in that moment. But so I would say really depends on your situation and your plan. So I'm sitting on the fence on that one, I'm afraid.
No, I'm with you entirely. I'm with you entirely. I think landlording is a long thing, and as you said, so beautifully linked to the show's title, it very much depends on your personal landlord journey. So I think we're done for this week, Romesh. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much on that note. I think we should say goodbye.
And goodbye, everyone. See you next time.
Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.